Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. My name is Jenny Smith, and I am the chair of the Cloud Cafes on behalf of Stroud District Green Party. We've been doing these for quite a few years now. We've had lots of different interesting speakers and subjects, but this is a subject matter tonight that is really on everyone's minds. It's a topic of the day. Everybody's talking about AI, but hopefully we've got some expert speakers here for you tonight that are just going to explain a little bit about the risks, the possibilities, the potential of what AI is and what it means. Are we optimistic about the future with artificial intelligence, or are we fearful about what it means and what its potential is? I'm not going to go into any more detail than that. I know that our speakers are going to give you a very interesting talk on this topic. So our first speaker, who we're very grateful for joining us tonight, is Steve Wells, who is a futurist, a speaker, facilitator, and founder of Informing Choices Limited, an insights business specializing in future studies and foresight. He's done a lot of keynote speeches, presentations, does education events and horizon scanning studies made to help individuals and organizations make informed choices about their roles in the emerging future. So, Steve, if you'd like to kick us off with your 10-minute talk on AI. Thank you so much.
Jenny, thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. So the first thing I think I'd like to say is that artificial intelligence, amongst other things, is really forcing us to think about how we learn a new dance, because the power and the potential of these technologies are so radically different than anything that we've seen before, that they really challenge our traditional mindsets. I think it forces us to monitor some of these changes so we can make sense of the forces in the external world, that we can deploy ethical and human thinking as a way to make sure that we enhance technologies like AI for the good of humanity, but that we also support our colleagues in developing insight and developing skills in evaluating what some of these plausible multiple futures might be associated with artificial intelligence. And fundamentally, this is about really laying future foundations, building talent, agility, resilience, and an innovation culture into what we do, the way that we do it, the way that we make sense of these technologies. But I think, first of all, we need to put technology into the context of all the other really big changes that we're seeing going on around the world. They're going on around us at every minute of every day. From society and social systems, things like growing notion of the importance of equity, our desire for personalization, everything designed to meet my needs, the shifting notions of personal values, how important sustainability is, what we think of work-life balance, something that's really been triggered by the pandemic. New ideas about what it means to be a member of a family, growing nature, or the changing nature of spirituality, of religion, and then how some of the more structured things that we see in society need to change. Things like health as the population ages, as perhaps the first person has already been born that would live to be 150, and how education and training needs to shift to make sure that we educate people fit for this future. And then, of course, we have the environmental imperatives, thinking about climate change, energy use, energy generation. All these technologies, they need more and more energy. So how do we balance that need with the generation of electricity in environmentally sustainable ways? How do we protect biodiversity, particularly pollinators, who are crucial in agriculture? Protecting our natural ecosystems as well as protecting the natural environment from human encroachment. And if we think about what I think of anyway as the need to reinvent economics, we're kind of struggling through the post-COVID economic recovery. And the whole COVID thing was a bit weird, wasn't it? Because it started off as a health crisis. It sort of morphed into a social crisis, became an economic crisis, and sort of ended as a political crisis. And I think there's a really interesting lesson there about how some of these really big disruptions that come out of our awareness, if you like, not that one should have done, um, and and how these issues kind of just merge together. We're also seeing things like the economic impact, the fallout of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the increasing tension between the West and China. We saw how supply chains were affected by the disruption caused by the pandemic. We see these economic power shifts from West to East. And one of the key lessons we're learning both through the pandemic and I think also through the conflict in Ukraine is how easily our supply chains are fragmented and broken. And then, of course, we've got the kind of the digital play into the economy, the role of cryptocurrencies, the use of digital platforms, the disappearance of cash. And I was talking on a BBC program about that just a couple of weeks ago, how we continue to grow sustainably and the role that the circular economy might play in that. And then we need to think about the kind of geopolitical context as well. And I've touched on some of these already, but I always think the first one is still really about the UK finding its place in the world after Brexit. This antagonistic relationship with China, not just about Chinese influence in democratic processes, but Chinese expansion in the South China Sea, the tensions with Taiwan. The Russian situation in Ukraine comes up again, and political polarization both in country and between countries, and what seems to be a growing discourse between democracy and autocracy. And finally, the kind of the jumping off point to talk about AI here is the exponential science and technology developments and just the plethora of new technologies we're seeing. And it's not just about AI, although I think AI joins many of these together. We should really lump into a conversation about AI, 3D printing, 4D printing, quantum computing, atomically precise manufacturing and nanotechnology, immersive technologies, the metaverse, blockchain, cryptocurrency, synthetic biology, robotics and drones, human enhancement, as well as artificial intelligence, because the power in these technologies isn't in any individual technology on its own. It's when we bring them together, when we basically form collaborations, if you like, between these technologies. And let me talk about one example of that now, because we're often hear about how important AI is to autonomous mobility, to self-driving cars. But if you think about it, it doesn't actually start and stop there. So a self-driving car in the future is likely to be 3D printed. It's likely to be 3D printed with materials that can fix themselves, that can mend themselves, self-repairing materials. It's likely to be hosted on a blockchain, ownership in a different way. We won't own cars individually, but what we'll be able to do is access a self-owning, self-repairing, self-driving autonomous car. It's the power of these technologies in combination that create that. We're starting to see the growth in just grab and go stores, started with the Amazon Go concept store, but we're seeing other major supermarket chains in the UK all trying the same technology. And it's great for some consumers to just go in, pick up what they want and walk out. But then there are broader societal questions about how did the use of this technology play into social exclusion? Because typically we find perhaps poorer or older people unable to access some of those technologies. What does it do for the number of people that we employ in these businesses? And actually, does it change how we use real estate in the retail sector? And there are some really interesting technologies that actually can make a real difference right now to some really basic things that we do. Imagine checking into a hotel. We walk up to the check-in desk and we have three check-in operators. Can't remember what they're called. Anyway, one of them is a robot that looks like a robot that we used to imagine a robot should look like in the 80s. Another one looks a bit like a person, but is a robot. And the third one is a velociraptor. Now, just checking into a hotel, all of a sudden you get a very different experience. But this is a real check-in desk for a theme park in Japan. And of course, it's the velociraptor that's the most popular check-in desk. But sometimes technologies have unintended consequences. There's a company producer, I can't remember their name off the top of my head. They're producing a smart mattress. The idea is that the mattress is filled with sensors that can diagnose your sleep, tell you perhaps what you might do to get a better night's sleep. Great. But what it will also do is it will send a message to your mobile device when your mattress is being used and you're not there. Now, I'm not quite sure what that says about trust, but then, we have these things kind of permeating away in the background. Then all of a sudden, ChatGPT happens and it changes everything. It changes our perspective on artificial intelligence. So what might we see with automation technologies over the near to longer term? Well, in what I think of as now and next, I suspect we'll see AI adopted by most firms. We'll see self-editing software. We'll see intelligent agents, real-time translation, a real Babel fish, smart machines, smart sensors, smart objects, and swarm robotics. If we then move into the midterm, perhaps we'll see almost all of customer interactions through artificial intelligence. We'll see AI in product development. We'll see autonomous vehicles everywhere, and AI deployed across the majority of government and public services. And then in the longer term, with the promise of artificial general intelligence, perhaps, all sectors, all functions will see AI as part of their everyday operations. We'll even see fully autonomous firms that don't have employees, self-aware, self-replicating software, systems, and robots. And as I say, the emergence of general artificial intelligence. So I think that the direction of travel into the future is set in terms of what we might expect to see. But let's not get tied up in, well, this is a potentially dystopian future, because I think there are some big choices we make to make sure that what we do is help people to live fulfilling lives, even in a highly digitized, highly automated society. And perhaps we might see AI playing a major role in our physical, our mental and cultural well-being through personalized healthcare, through the use of AI in education and mental health support, enhancing communication, almost kind of becoming a sort of arbitrator in disputes, helping us develop empathy and understanding, used in elderly care, and used to help our interaction with arts and culture, so that actually we can continue to develop our own very perspective on what it means to be human. Perhaps we'll see artificial intelligence rethinking work and wealth for our economic well-being, augmenting the jobs that we do for those of us that have jobs, getting rid of all repetitive tasks, freeing up time for us as humans to focus on creative, strategic, empathetic aspects of work. There is a kind of a but here, though, isn't there? Because perhaps those kind of skills are not the skills that everyone in society has. So we still need to think about what changes do we make to society that help people to live fulfilling lives. AI can also help us in financial inclusion, in making sure that the decisions that we make from a financial perspective are for our good and for the greater good of the people around us. We can also think of environmental conservation and sustainability, AI analyzing and predicting environmental patterns, assisting in the management and the preservation of our natural resources, helping us to create a more sustainable future for our children. And then local, national and international politics, AI being used in urban planning to help create smarter, more sustainable and people-friendly cities, analysing on traffic problems, although perhaps some of the traffic problems go away when all the vehicles are autonomous. Helping in crisis response to identify, predict and respond to natural disasters, public health emergency and other crises. And finally, conflict resolution and peacekeeping. AI-powered tools could help analyze and predict potential conflicts, facilitate diplomatic negotiations. AI could be designed to be the very neutral voice and help us reach logical conclusions. And finally, in terms of sort of human-centric technology, AI could be the technology that really opens up public transport for everyone. Public transport could cost near zero if we're using some of these technologies to build the vehicles and AI to help allocate and run them. But I think this happens if we change as a society our mindset. And actually that's really, really hard, because we've got very used as a society to relying on those things that's made us successful. So do we play by the games that we've always played? Do we try to force fit some of the things that we're thinking about artificial intelligence into our historical, our more traditional mindset, or do we create a new game? And the thing is, we need to remember, even from an enterprise perspective, how important it is playing a new game. There was a study a little while ago done by McKinsey that looked at the Standard & Poor 500 index, and what they found was that in 1958, the average age of a corporation was 60 years. Today, it's 18. So there's a question, why has the average age of a corporation reduced so much? Not only that, McKinsey reckon that this pattern is going to continue. And they say that by 2027, 75% of the companies currently quoted in the S&P 500 will no longer exist. So I think we need to understand not only the potential good and bad of artificial intelligence and the group of technologies that sit around what typically people think of as AI, and what actually that means in the context of change for people, because people don't resist change, they resist being changed. And these technologies have the potential to change all of us. I've no idea if that was 10 minutes or not. Have I done?
Don't worry, you've not done too badly at all. Don't worry. But you've kicked us off fantastically. So thank you very much for that overview, Steve. I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions and lots of discussion that come from that. So
Very welcome.
really appreciate you starting us off. So yeah, I mean, lots of interesting points. I think you're right about how AI is going to affect every single part of our lives, whether it's the economy or the environment, education. I can see areas where it's already seeping in, translation. Even I regularly get a ChatGPT to write my emails for me now, because it takes a long time and some people are busy. So yeah, there's ways and means of it seeping in already, but I think it'll be interesting to see what comes of it. Okay, our second speaker, our very own, I'm sure everybody knows him already, but it's Tim Davies, who is the Director of Research and Practice for Connected by Data, the campaign to give communities a powerful voice in how data is governed. He's worked at the intersection of technology, governance, and open government for the last decade, and doing work on participatory governance for data standardization and AI. He's written on algorithms, AI, and open data, and the potential for global deliberations on AI governance, and definitely has one of the biogs with the most big words in it for me. So there we go, Tim. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And it's yeah, no, having been on the other side of the chairing for these at the start, and now I'm finding myself in the panel, it's really good to join you from here and my most of more day job work on how we get people in charge really of these technological developments. So Steve has taken us into the future. I want to take us a bit back to the past and then stay very much in the kind of present of AI. So there are many different kinds of AI. When we use that term, it's capturing a lot of things. And if you go back to the conferences in the 60s and 70s when things were emerging, people were first building what were called expert systems and knowledge graphs. These were attempts to manually represent what it was that made humans smart and intelligent, and to build these vast data sets that sort of say, this concept is connected to this concept is connected to this one, and let's build computers that can reason across that and work out through a sort of logical deductive idea of how humans might work and what intelligence is, a very abstract model of intelligence. And those things started to get big, started to demand lots of data, and we had an explosion around the 2000s onwards of vast amounts of big data being available. The internet gave us vast quantities of content people were publishing and so on. And we got into a more modern age of AI around machine learning. So instead of working out in advance these kind of logical connections, researchers realized if you essentially throw enough data at a process, you can get a statistical output that looks right. But it's not reasoned to be right. It's just inductively you've thrown enough kind of information and data, processed it through various algorithms, and you get answers out the other side that essentially mimic the right answer, rather than learning the rules and the reasoning structures behind it. And that gives us this very curious phenomenon of our modern generative AI, which can generate answers that will tend to be accurate at times and give us progress and ways forward in things, but can't actually work out how they got there. And interestingly, what we discover in the process is some of the time humans work like that as well. Some of the times we're deductive reasoners and we can show the logic. Other times we've got this kind of, well, we know it, but we don't know how we know it. And what we have right now is these generative AI technologies that, to simplify massively, but sort of say something but don't know how they got there often, and can't show their reasoning, can't show their sourcing. And the big challenge is those things are trained off all the content or data we put online, the images, the text, and that's a reflection of the world we've been in rather than always the world we want to be in. So there is an inherent conservatism in a sense to the way those AI systems are built and work. They reflect back the biases in our society unless we very, very consciously work to challenge those biases in how the technology is designed, built and developed. And if you think of all the text that's online, you can think there are some pretty big biases in there, whether those are gender biases, racial biases, which parts of the world are represented online, which topics, themes, and so on. So immense power of these generative systems that will create new text, create images, problem solve essentially by chaining together those different steps, but also some real challenges in them. And I particularly want to recognize that we have had some fantastic researchers who for more than a decade have been kind of looking at this and asking questions, people like Mary Mitchell, Timnit Gebru, and others who were raising the kind of alarm bells, as it were, around some of those challenges in generative AI 3, 4, 5 years ago with large language models before ChatGPT kind of came out. And interestingly, they were dismissed from the companies they were working for, the Googles and others in that research, and things have ploughed forward. So one of the ways I like to think about these AI systems, though, is not as some abstract technology, but in terms of products, because ultimately ChatGPT is a product. It's a packaging together of technologies, and Steve pointed this out also, that what we get is not AI, it's AI packaged with something else, packaged into a mobility product, packaged into a medical product that comes with another set of technologies alongside it. And when we think about them as products, we can start asking new questions. We don't have to ask, what is AI in general? We ask, what does this product do? Does it make our lives better? Does it cause harms? Who profits from it? How can we use it well? And as with many products, how should we regulate it? Should we allow it to be freely used, available to everyone, or should there be some limits on it? Who's responsible when it goes wrong? Who should benefit when it goes right? And recognizing that these are built off our data, and that's both our data about you and me, but also our collective data and commons. We need to think about what we make of that in terms of how this is using a common resource and how we should use and control that. So I pose myself the question, am I optimistic or not? I think, again, Steve's painted this really optimistic picture of how these technologies can be applied for good. And I think we should not neglect that. We should not forget that there are chances to design and develop and build on these products and technologies in ways that can help address and solve some of the big problems we're facing. At the same time, I think we do need to look at those very real harms that are happening now, and the way we have some products that have been rushed to market without necessarily thinking through and taking full responsibility for those consequences, and ask some really critical questions about them. And I think I pair product with power when we get Tony Benn's kind of questions on power of what power do you have, where did you get it from, in whose interests are you exercising it, who are you accountable to, and how can we get rid of you? And I want to ask those questions of technologies as well. And as Ben posed them, they're not necessarily saying we don't think you should have power, you shouldn't be there. It's just we need to know the answers to those to have technologies, AI, that's kind of working for humans rather than the other way around. And interestingly, I was in a meeting last week where one of the people from the Future of Life Institute who wrote this big letter on an AI pause was ultimately reasoning to those same questions of sort of, who are these systems loyal to? Are they loyal to their users or to their creators? So I'm just going to put 5 things I think we maybe need to explore in terms of responses to AI right now. And these are different levels of abstraction and so on, not a full theory. But I think firstly, we do need a moratorium on certain AI products and their use at this point in time. So again, the conference I was at last week, RightsCon, people talking, we've got 70 national elections around the world next year. And we have a technology that's been launched that is misinformation on steroids. If it falls in the wrong hands, is used in the wrong ways. So from the perspective of our democracies, there's a very good case to say the use of that technology in the context of elections, we do not have enough evidence yet on how that should be used, and we should have strong regulatory action to say, until we've had a big public debate about what this technology does to democracy, we should be very, very cautious and should have regulators making sure it's not there, exacerbating some of the challenges we've had in open democratic discourse where we're not being manipulated, but we're being allowed to debate. And that micro-targeting risk that it has. Second thought, I think we need to really think about the distribution of profits from these, because one of the tendencies of the particular products we've got is they're very centralizing. They centralize power with a few organizations, and that doesn't have to be the design. And interestingly, there's lots of open source AI that is potentially going to disrupt that quite quickly. But right now, a few actors are accumulating profits from this. And we need to think, if labor's being replaced, what's the appropriate investment back into retraining or work transitions that helps that? And it's interesting that it's not been the jobs we expected that are most at risk. You know, go back 5 years, people weren't thinking it's the lawyers or the artists who the AI jobs would be lost from first. And yet that's some of the areas you see some of the big threats. But as Greens, I think we have a real opportunity there. We have values of what good work looks like. How do we create good work for people, not the alienating work of correcting the machine translation, but doing rich translation where translation's needed. We have those values of the 4-day week, of exploring universal basic income, things that are the policies we need in this era of AI changing the job market, and we should really explore that. I think we need to account for the climate impacts of these models. They are computationally much more expensive to ask ChatGPT to answer a question than to do a web search on Google. And that's cumulative. That carbon cost adds up of training and running these models, and that needs to be accounted for, just as in the way we've asked other industries to account for their carbon cost. I think we do need that reality check, not to say there's no potential here, but to focus on what are the material limits of AI that are hit. What's the, you know, I don't think there is a logical connection between generative AI we have now in terms of ChatGPT and artificial general intelligence. I just don't buy that narrative at all. There's too big a gulf there that we suddenly get the AGI tomorrow. And I think that narrative we're hearing about the smart killer robots or the sort of artificial general intelligence that takes over is a very convenient narrative for firms who want to distract us from the real world consequences now, to focus on I'd say quite implausible futures based on again logical human reasoning. So I think we need narratives and to tell stories that empower rather than overwhelm us about what these technologies are doing. And lastly, and the theme I focus on in work most of all, is we need participatory oversight. We need citizens to be able to discuss, debate, and oversee these technologies, as we've had public debates around new technologies in the past. And it's been interesting to see even the firms themselves turning to this, at least in rhetoric. OpenAI, behind ChatGPT, have launched a fund at the moment for experiments in democratic input into their algorithms. Now they frame that quite narrowly as how do we align these algorithms with human values. A number of us are working on proposals that say let's frame that more broadly about how do we make sure people have the chance to both say what they want individual products to do, but also how they want this space to be regulated. Essentially, to answer that question, in whose interests is this power of AI regulated and exercised, in whose interests are it exercised? Because essentially we have got a powerful new tool that can do many of the positive things Steve outlined, but we also have to make sure that that power is accountable power, and power and green power, essentially. In that way. So I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Tim. You've made some really key points, I think, and a lot of some things that I'd considered previously and some things that I haven't. I think the challenge that you gave around bias, I mean, like, to me, this is history repeating ourselves. A lot of our history is from a white man's perspective, and now we're seeing that AI is bringing these answers again from, like you say, what goes in comes out the other end. And if it's, you know, a white male dominated area, then obviously that's the answers that we're going to get. I heard the other day that Donald Trump has already created a deep fake video for within his campaign for the 2024 elections. And I think that, like, what can now happen within deep fake video creation is really scary. And equally with things like voice recreation and things like that, I find again fascinating, and like how that is controlled. What we talked about, job threats, like you said, artists thought that they were going to be the last ones to go when it came to job takeover by AI or robots or whatever it might say. But yeah, one of my colleagues is talking about like intellectual property rights and how people can protect themselves in arts and creative worlds. So really fascinating talk. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm sure that, again, there'll be more questions at the end for you. Okay, so our final speaker, again, somebody that's definitely well known in these circles, Natalie Bennett. We thank you so much for joining us tonight. I know that very busy. She was the leader of the Green Party of England and Wales from 2012 to 16, and then was appointed to the House of Lords in 2019, and is constantly representing the Green voice in a very strong and inspiring manner. So I get, like always, Natalie, we really appreciate you for that. She's worked for The Telegraph, The Independent, The Times, and has spent 5 years as editor of The Guardian Weekly. She has a master in communication from the University of Leicester, with a thesis on the relationship between readers and texts on the internet, which I'm sure is very relevant at this time. So thank you, Natalie. Take us away.
Thank you very much, Jenny, and thank you for that lovely introduction. And it's great to be back with Stroud, and I have to say, engaged in what has already been, and I'm sure will continue to be, a fascinating discussion this evening on a topic in which, as you alluded to, I've got a great deal of interest. 20 years ago, my thesis, in part in Leicester, dealt with artificial intelligence and claims about what intelligence was and what machine intelligence was. And back 20 years ago, we were almost that close to getting artificial intelligence. And my thesis tonight starts by saying where it's rather like fusion, nuclear power. We're always just getting almost there. You know, you can see it in sight, but that insight keeps moving on to the distance. And one of the things that I'll just reflect on from that thesis is, if we look at where a lot of the discussion is coming from now, we're still coming from what's often known as a transhumanist or a post-humanist perspective. And the writer with whom I most engaged on my thesis was a guy called Hans Moravec. And this tends to be a very gendered perspective. And the idea of people at the extreme of this field suggests that what we all have to do is get away from the meat, get away from mortality, and imprint your intelligence on a neutron star, and then you'll be immortal. And part of my thesis was very focused on a claim that intelligence is actually something that's extremely embodied, you cannot separate mind and body, and intelligence has to relate to our physical interactions with the world around us. And if there is ever going to be artificial intelligence, it won't look anything like ChatGPT, which is not, I would say, artificial intelligence, but it would have to be an embodied intelligence that interacts with the world. So that's my sort of highfalutin stuff. Just to bring us down to the current day, I'm also at the moment fairly deep in the online harms bill, which has been just about to finish its committee stage in the House of Lords, which is where we have our initial debate. We will then, in a couple of weeks, be going into report stage where we'll actually have votes on things. And one of the things, picking up the point we've just been talking about deep fakes and the risks of that, one of the clauses that I'm likely to be championing at report stage is about the need for critical thinking and education. And people need help to be able to navigate the world that we're facing now. But one of the things that I put forward is that this is actually not just an issue, or especially an issue about digital. We have schools that are forced to teach to the test. Pupils are to absorb a whole lot of information and regurgitate it in the exam. And if we're going to prepare people for the future, the critical thinking needs to apply right across the board. It's not something that just applies to digital. So some of the main points that I wanted to bring up is I think an interesting point to start of some of the claims that are being made around AI now is a headline from the FT from the 8th of June, and it reads, "AI revives moribund software stocks." We are seeing a massive hype with very strong financial interests behind it. And I think this is interesting when we see our current Prime Minister, the government's approach to the financial sector, to IT, to digital. The Prime Minister is still in favour of unicorns, these companies that get massive amounts of money invested in them over a few years, and the idea is they're going to grow to great scale. And interestingly, again, the FT, and I find myself quoting the FT a lot these days, in 2018, I think it was, ran a headline saying why the idea of unicorns is dead, because what most of these unicorns have done have been created, chewed through vast amounts of money, and then collapsed again. And that is something, having often done a great deal of social damage along the way. Now, so picking up a point that Tim made, it really is important to acknowledge that AI, all of the digital tools and medium that we're talking about now are not in the cloud. They're absolutely down to earth here on Earth. They use about 3% of the electricity that's used in the world now at this moment. And if you look at the greenhouse gas emissions, because quite a bit of it is already through renewables, it's 2% of greenhouse gas emissions come from digital technologies, giant data server farms, etc. And that's about equivalent to the airline industry. If you think about what we think about as the Green Party about the airline industry, I think it sort of puts that into the framework. What we have now is not artificial intelligence. So-called generative AI, as I've already alluded to, I would say is actually entirely plagiarism. Now we're starting to see some engagement of this. Jenny, you talked about artists, and there's a real question about, yes, ChatGPT can produce an image for you by crunching together half a dozen artists' piece of work, but that's also, of course, what it's doing with words. And where, what kind of rent, what does ChatGPT owe to everyone who created all of the things that put that together? And that's an issue that really only is just starting to get on the agenda. I'd also question the actual quality. I mean, like everyone else, I'm sure on this call, I've had a play with ChatGPT. And you look at the quality of what it produces. And speaking as an old journalist, what it looks like to me is it basically produces the kind of formulaic, churn through clickbait journalism, which so many young journalists have been forced into by events, by the technological economic structure of the way our journalism's gone. Those are really what David Graeber described as bullshit jobs. And I would posit that a huge amount of what ChatGPT produces is like bullshit job production. Continuing sort of on the point about use of energy. It's interesting that we have a huge amount of talk of it's going to grow and grow and grow. And also we're going to become entirely dependent on this. And if it grows and grows and grows and we become entirely dependent on it, what happens when things go wrong? I was with the Greenhouse think tank a few years ago doing a post-mortem about what happened in Lancaster after they'd had really bad floods, and the power went down for about 2.5 days and Lancaster nearly fell apart. What happens then when the power goes? We're in an age of shocks. If we become dependent on these technologies, what we lack is the kind of resilience that we desperately need. A few other points to make. Digital exclusion. There's a lot of focus now on digital exclusion, and that, of course, if we think on a global scale, huge numbers of people still don't have access in the world to electricity, let alone access to digital services. but digital exclusion in the UK, it's often seen as a generational thing, and it tends to be older people who are digitally excluded. But I've been thinking about this quite a lot and realizing that actually even someone who's a digital native won't necessarily remain able to engage with the full level of digital arrangements that we have now. People's hearing goes, their sight goes, they get a bit confused about things, and digital tools, AI, can't necessarily cope with that. And the capacity of AI to deal with really sophisticated human interactions. I think it's interesting, self-driving cars. Steve was talking about self-driving cars, and I was actually at the climate talks COP24 in Bonn in 2017, and there was a huge, almost panic then, a feeling that self-driving cars, self-driving trucks were just around the corner again. And there was a big concern about trucks, lorries in particular, that there was potentially a huge increase in carbon emissions, because what's the limit really on the carbon emissions of a lorry now is the driver has to stop for the legislated rest periods. And if you had AI trucks, they could just keep running all of the time. But you'll notice that that's something that's totally gone off the boil. And they've actually found that AI, what we have now in self-driving cars, etc., has really, really struggled to cope with the real world. And it probably has some applications in some really limited controlled environments. But if you think of the streets of London down the road, from the city of London down the road from where I am in Westminster now, you think about what those ancient medieval streets are like. We are not going to see self-driving cars on anything like that anytime soon. I also want to pick up the point about elder care and indeed youth care. A robot cannot provide care. A robot can provide medical assistance. A robot can provide practical things and, measure blood pressure and test blood glucose and all sorts of things like that. It might physically arrange to dump a cup of tea beside you. But I would posit that that's actually only human interaction can be care. And I would also, today we saw headlines around ChatGPT could be marking children's homework. And I come back to the point I made about what the outputs of ChatGPT are like and what we would be forcing our pupils to do. It would be an even more extreme form of teaching to the test. Teaching to ChatGPT would, I would suggest, have a horrendous impact on the quality of our education. So a couple of final things to comment on. And I'm going to go back a wonderful quote, because the phrase or the term Luddite will often be familiar to lots of people. And there was a wonderful, amazing 19-year-old called John Booth, who was a Luddite, who in 1812 was involved in an attack on a textile mill. And it's a reminder about youth leadership in politics is no new thing. It didn't start with the climate strikers. And the most famous thing that John Booth is often quoted for was he was tortured and died from the torture because the authorities were trying to get the names of his accomplices out of him. And as he lay dying, a priest leant over to him and said, my son, can you tell me anything now? And John Booth said to him, can you keep a secret, father? And the father, who was, of course, with the authorities, said yes. And John Booth said, yes, so can I. And he died without giving away any of his compatriots. But rather more sort of seriously, I just couldn't avoid telling that John Booth story, but he was a Luddite, but he was also on the record as saying that machinery could be man's chief blessing instead of his curse if society were differently constituted. So what I'm going to finish on is positing a suggestion that what the future looks like will not be determined by technology. It's politics that will determine what our future looks like. We have the power to decide how we use or don't use, what restrictions, what ownership, what controls we put on. And I will just mention, I'll stick a link in the chat, very timely out today, and picking up some of the points Tim made about the discriminatory way in which things like facial recognition software, all of those problems. It's Big Brother Watch and many other organisations have put out a paper, Key Principles for an Alternative AI White Paper, tacking on some of the points that against what the government has said. I'll put the link in the chat in a second. I'll also put a link in a chat to, I was in Brussels a couple of weeks ago, the absolutely wonderful Beyond Growth 2023 conference. And there was a digital session there, which covers a lot more, not specifically about AI, but broader the digital issues that I've raised. So there's a lot of stuff out here. And I guess, remember that this is a matter of politics and decision making, nothing about determining. And that's something as the Green Party we have to acknowledge, and also acknowledge that we have original different things to say about this in a way that no one else does, and we have to make sure our voice is here and we are speaking out and visible and heard on these issues. Nothing is inevitable. History is not pre-written. It's not made by technology, it's made by human actions, and that's what we need to talk about and work with. The technology could run away with us, and I will just, sorry, I've said finally about 3 times in a very politician way, but absolutely finally. I am concerned about some aspects of technology. I think it was Tim made a reference to killer robots. And I was actually part of the drive to get an inquiry into what are more properly known as lethal autonomous weapon systems in the House of Lords. We've got a select committee looking into that now. And there is some seriously scary possibilities about that. Something we might or might not want to talk about later. In some ways, I think focusing on the social perhaps is where we might want to go this evening. But there are some real issues around killer robots, and they could do some really, really unthinkable things, and people could design some terrible systems. Except, of course, we already have nuclear weapons, which are utterly unthinkable, hideous weapons of mass destruction. Just like, you know, we've been talking about all this stuff about AI is going to destroy the world and take over the planet. One of the best things I saw about that was someone saying the greatest risk is AI doing what we ask it to, not doing what we ask it to. But more than that, of course, talking about this helps distract from the climate emergency, the nature crisis, the things that genuinely at this moment right now do threaten this planet. Thanks very much, and I'll stick some links in the chat.
Thanks so much, Natalie. That was yeah, really interesting. Again, fantastic to have more different perspectives brought to the table. What you were saying around critical thinking in our education, I think is something that is absolutely vital. And I don't think it's just for young people. I have older people asking me, like, how do you know that a website is fake? And it's something that when you trust what you see on the internet, it's very difficult to decipher between what's real and what's not. And if you don't know those key indicators and those key points, it's really, really difficult. I think what you're saying around green politics and the high consumption of energy that all of these things take is really important and something that we need to think more about. I did not realize it has a similar greenhouse gas output to the aviation system. So yeah, loads of other interesting things. Of course, politics is what determines our future, not technology. My partner always says the only danger with computers is the humans that are using them. So I think that is definitely the case in this, like you said. And I know that maybe we'll stay on the more social side of things tonight, but weapons and what that means and what that looks like is really, again, very scary. There was somebody who managed to hack the system that controlled a dam, and they could have opened up that dam to drown several villagers because the system that was put in place to protect the security of the dam was like so basic that someone could easily access it. And you think how many things like that are like manual meets technology where you know, get into the wrong hands, and things can be very scary. So a lot of food for thought there, and really appreciate you joining us this evening and sharing your thoughts. Okay, so there's been lots going on in the chat already. So I think our first comment is from Bear Stroud. I know there's a lot of information that you've put into there, so if you want to just give us a 1-minute summary of what you've said and then ask your question at the end, that would be great. If you're still with us, Bear.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Sorry,
Fantastic.
I've camera problems at the moment. It's not clicked on. Yes, looking with a number of I love the idea of AI and everything making life better and people having more free time. But trying to have a fairness across the world rather than it being certain people dictating is essentially it, and everyone having a voice in what's to come, as opposed to certain people with the power dictating to others. And that's the fundamental issue, looking at the facts of certain people like the WEF saying they want to control it and have their 1% dictating to the world how it all works, which doesn't seem to fit with how I feel that everyone should have a say. And that in a nutshell is the heart of my point.
Okay, thanks so much, Bear. Do any of our speakers want to come back on that?
I guess I can briefly pick up on that because something that there's been big discussions about is the kind of participatory oversight that AI needs. And you've seen pitches from Rishi Sunak around the UK should be a kind of hub of AI regulation, but really we should be pushing for a strong global conversation on that, exactly as Bear's pointing, that who are those across the globe who are underrepresented in the training sets, but disproportionately impacted by decisions made using AI systems. So real practical ones. Companies are already turning to this for content moderation online, particularly, the big social media platforms don't invest enough in content moderation and oversight. With all those elections coming up, they'll be applying quite likely AI systems to deciding what comments are posted or aren't posted. And if you're a smaller country, not valued as much, your election is at risk from that system not understanding local languages, local context, and so on. So we have a really interesting challenge of first making sure the systems we do have are more representative in terms of the internal bit of the AI systems, but then also having that important public conversation about how we choose whether or not we want these technologies to be deployed in certain contexts. When do we want that, and when don't we? So I think there's a really important conversation to be developing there. Encouragingly, the people who were behind things like the Global Citizens Assembly on Climate Change, which was a fantastic kind of experiment in global participatory democracy, are also bringing their expertise to thinking about this matter as well. So where kind of that climate action has led, I think it's built some empowerment really to then apply some of those same things to what's happening in AI, and I'm quite hopeful there'll be some movement there in the near future.
Thanks, Tim. Okay, fantastic. If anybody, just unmute yourself, speakers, if you'd like to come in on anything. Natalie, thanks.
Just to say a couple of things. I mean, I said politics should be what everyone does not have done to them. History is not pre-written; it's made. So the argument, the base argument is the same about whether we tackle our inequality, whether we tackle our climate emergency, all sorts of other things. It's not a specific area just contained to this field. We need to change all of our politics. Our politics is not democratic now. And I think some of the things that fits very well with thinking about what we can do where there are perhaps from big data rather than actual genuine AI, where big data does give us potential savings in need for labour, is, as the Green Party's long been calling for, universal basic income that gives people security. And that is something that's some of the big tech people are calling for. I think they're wrong about AI replacing jobs, but nonetheless, it's there as a possibility. But I think perhaps in some ways even more relevantly, the idea of a 4-day working week as standard with no loss of pay. And the New Economics Foundation has actually done a lot of work in the past about a 3-day working week eventually is no loss of pay. And if we think about a kind of world where we have less stuff but more life, and some of the simple drudgery is indeed taken over by digital technology, not with more digital technology doing more things, but in a trade out between human labour and some of the digital. And I think to really make this concrete, thinking about how do we fund research and thinking. One of the things I love is the fact that Patreon and websites like that, I know lots of podcasts where people have given up their day job because they're able to be funded by lots of people paying £5 a month because they like their podcasts, or indeed journalism's being funded in Manchester, Sheffield and Liverpool. There's podcasts that are doing, there's weekly email, a couple of times a week emails putting out news from those places. So there's all kind of different models and way of doing things, of creatively modeling things that aren't giving people jobs in companies or even in government organizations or whatever. We're seeing a much more fluid situation arise, and that's some of the possibilities of the technology that we have now. And I'm going to also put a little note in the chat. I've got a book coming out funded by such forms of funding, crowdfunded, and I'll put a little advert in the chat about that if that's all right.
Yes, please do, Natalie. I'm sure that everybody here will be of interest for that. So
I just add something here, because what I always find really interesting is that lots of these conversations about the implications of these technologies is very often based, and I'm not accusing anyone of doing this here, but it's very often based on current thinking. And I think this is the critical importance of enabling people to use foresight to think about the future. Because if we understand how some of the trends that we see right now are looking as if they're going to play out, but then we challenge those assumptions by using recognized foresight tools. So what is it that might happen that changes the direction of these different trends that we see? And that way we can actually create a range of different plausible futures and understand what it is that actually takes us towards one or other of those futures. Because the thing is that we actually don't understand much about the future. We think we do, and we use lots of kind of fairly traditional processes to extrapolate what we know from the past, put that into the future and say, that's how the future is going to play out. And that is not the case. I think we would all agree, if we kind of park that notion for a minute, that actually the future is increasingly uncertain, it's increasingly complex. So where are the tools within areas of policy development that actually allow us to think about a range of plausible futures so we really understand the potential? They don't have to be right. That's not the idea, I think. So other futurists might disagree with it, but that's not the point of foresight. The point of foresight is to explore how the future might play out so we can make some good decisions now. And I think that's what I would like to see more in politics. Now, bizarrely, I know from personal experience, and I'm sure you do, Natalie, there's bunches of really good work that happens in the civil service in this area. There's loads of really fascinating stuff. But of course, once the politics gets hold of it, then it's not necessarily palatable, given the relatively short time frame that politicians tend to be in position for. So you get this quite short-termism that I think matches what we see in the private sector as well. So, you know, my plea for anyone involved in politics is use foresight, think about foresight, get these different views, create plausible but challenging views of the future, and then see how that changes your view of what kind of decisions we might want to take right now.
I think bouncing off that, Steve, if I may, Jenny, I think there's a huge problem with the quality of thinking and the quality of inputs. Not so much the civil service, but certainly to our politics. We desperately lack systems thinking. We have scientists who think of our economic and social systems as a black box that just exists like that, will always exist like that. And we have very few people from a scientific background. You know, this is a huge problem in politics. There's very few people in the chamber. You know, the debate I had about the genetic technology, brackets, precision breeding, oh no, it isn't, bill, now act. There was literally 3 of us in the chamber slogging it out on the science, and everyone else was mostly there as a spectator. And that's, we've got a real problem. We have scientists looking at economics and social change as something that can't happen. Society is just there and will keep operating that way. And we have economists and social people who know nothing about science, or they did GCSE biology back 30 years ago, and they know nothing about the holobiome. They know nothing about the microbiome. They have a very mechanistic, reductionist view of science. And so that systems thinking is something we're desperately lacking. And anyone on this call who's thinking about starting their academic career, please look at doing that crossover between science and humanities and social sciences, and looking at the world in a systems kind of way, because we need an awful lot more of it.
Quite agree.
Thank you both for your comments on that, and thank you, Bear, for bringing it to the table. So our next question is from Lynn. Lynn, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Thank you, Jenny. I think there's a lot of fear about AI and how it's being used. And for me, I think one of the bases for the fears that people have about AI is that the whole concept of human rights is not being talked about. I don't hear it talked about in the same discussions about AI. And I think that, you know, many people and many organizations have worked for years to really push that human rights should be behind the decisions that we make, behind, you know, decisions about politically, decisions economically, socially. And I am really concerned about the use of AI. It can have really positive effects, I'm sure, but you look at examples of how it's being used in China, for example, to track people's movements and to really oppress minority populations. And I'm not sure that our systems and our international agreements and how we enforce them are really up to the task in dealing with this. And so I'm really curious what the three speakers think about this. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Lynn. Okay, it's yes, Natalie, you've unmuted first. That's how we're going to order this.
Okay, well, I put in the chat, Lynn. I hope you've got access to it. The link to the alternative AI white paper that I referred to, and if you look at some of the organisations signed up to that, there's Liberty. There's a form of human rights, a group of human rights lawyers. There's Refugee Council and Migrant Rights Network. There's Big Brother Watch. There's Fair Trials. So I think there is a lot of people across this space who are very concerned about this. I mean, you obviously won't hear Rishi Sunak or Israel talking about it, but then you don't hear them talking about human rights in other contexts. I say with some bitterness, having come to this meeting after being involved in the debate on the illegal migration bill. And yes, my stress was very deliberate there. So I think there is awareness of this, but again, we have a bit of that problem of the crossover of knowledge. There's not a lot of people who have really high level human rights knowledge skills and high level understanding of artificial intelligence and digital and IT. People tend to be in one or the other. And in fact, I actually spoke at the AGM of the Open Rights Group a few years ago, and they were talking then, the whole focus was on digital privacy and digital rights online. And I spent the whole meeting jumping up and down saying, don't just talk about this like it's a special discrete category. These are human rights. These are privacy rights. They happen to be digital, but we shouldn't be thinking of them separately. And the organisations all need to get together and campaign together. And that's something we need to see a lot more of.
Thanks, Natalie. And either of our other speakers like to come in on this? Tim?
No. So I think it's exactly the right question of like, what are these technologies that we should be making very strong human rights statements about not using? So facial recognition, for an example, has been banned in a number of US cities in response to kind of movements of people kind of highlighting the biases it has, the impacts it has, and saying this simply should not be being used. And I think some of those technologies fall into that space where we should be saying, on balance, do the benefits outweigh the harms, and who is harmed and who benefits? And in these cases, we see minorities, racialized communities, others are often those most harmed, and we should be standing and saying the benefits are really not there to justify this. If we want to invest, let's invest in community safety through other mechanisms rather than kind of surveillance technology. So again, but that's about the product application rather than the underlying technology, saying this product application of the tech is one we do not want to kind of see. And I think there is a big digital human rights movement, as Natalie says. Like I think the digital tech rights groups have been having to grow up quite fast and develop quite fast their ability to respond, to network, to connect. And people like Open Rights Group, where I'm on the advisory council, have done some really solid work recently of going, we need to link this to migration, and we need to focus on digital rights in the context of, say, migration, to really understand who is most affected and how we have concrete campaigning and advocacy on where technology is being applied, rather than what have in the past been quite sort of male middle class technical discussions and connected by data. We've been focusing a lot on the data protection and digital information bill that's going through Parliament at the moment, and very much trying to organise a cross section of civil society in the UK to act on that, and now working with a number of partners in working on G20 advocacy to say how in these fora do we make sure it's not the World Economic Forum voice only, but it's the civil society voice there, engaging really constructively in the debate. And what's been good about the framing of this discussion is it's not about saying all AI is bad or all tech's bad. It's not about saying all is good. It's I think, again, as Steve points out, going, let's think about this systemically. Let's weigh up and say, what kind of future do we want to value? Let's root that future in human rights that we've long developed and honed, rather than starting from scratch. But with those values, what kinds of futures do we value, and what kind of levers do we have to create change, which will sometimes be moratoria, sometimes it will be improving the technology, sometimes it will be education and transparency to say we're not sure yet, but we should at least make sure people know what's happening, so they've got the ability to have that discussion, debate, and the tussle over what we should and shouldn't use.
Thanks, Tim. I think you're exactly right. I did drop something into the chat as well of some campaign work that the Greens EFRAs, like Green EFRA or group in Parliament, are doing, especially around biometric surveillance and its effects on women and LGBTQIA+ communities as well, not just migrants and refugees at the same time. So I think it is something that is, again, seeping into public conversation, which is really important. Okay, Elizabeth, sorry, I missed you and I went straight to Lynn. So Elizabeth, if you want to unmute and ask your question, my apologies.
Hello. Well, I think that some of the my questions have been touched on by particularly Steve and Natalie, actually, but I am interested in the fact that Steve just touched on, the fact that we need some kind of societal change to make AI work effectively. And I'm assuming, Steve, that you don't mean that we need bigger and better capitalism, and that we probably need to focus more on caring for each other and the environment. But I'd just be interested for you to expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, well, shall I nail my colours to a political mast? I'm a conservative. So that may or may not be good substitution for tonight. But I think what's interesting is that I see a lot of the challenges and opportunities actually going beyond politics, because some of the things that we've been talking about tonight seem actually, quite good sense. So one of the quite good sense things that I think I sometimes think about is, if I imagine a world where artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotics, these range of automatic technologies actually reach the potential that some people think they might do, that's not necessarily a bad world, so long as the social structures that we put in place take account of that. Now, we might say one of those kind of social structures is the complete unlocking of society from what we've come to know as capitalism, because actually there's a really strong argument to be made from the idea that at some point in the future everything will be so cheap to manufacture that actually there's no profit for enterprise to make. And therefore, what do we do when the notion of profitability disappears? Because that really fundamentally changes the way economics, the way politics works, and actually what we do as humans. So the change that we need to potentially think about in one of these plausible scenarios in the future is what processes, what structures and that allow us to live fulfilling lives in the future. If we don't need to learn through education for work, what do we want to learn for? What do we want to learn about? What are the basic needs that we have, and how can we improve ourselves as people rather than improve ourselves in a jobs market that we've kind of become familiar with today? So I think there are lots of really interesting debates that we can have that actually, if we think about the trajectory that we're probably on with regards to some of these automation technologies, then we need to really start thinking about how those very different futures might play out. Universal basic income is always kind of the first port of call, isn't it? Because if we think we might be in a world in the future where there aren't enough jobs to go around, then actually that might be one way to do it. It's great. Doesn't work on its own. We still need to think about some of these other systems that need to be put in place to help us live fulfilling lives. So these technologies I do think they will be really sophisticated. I do believe that at some point in the future, they'll be much more pervasive, not necessarily in a bad way in our lives. But then what's the thinking we need to do now to make sure that as society adapts to those changes, that we're living in a better place than we are now?
Thanks, Steve. Do either of our other speakers want to come back on that?
Okay, yeah, I'll go very briefly of some of the adaptations or some tools for thinking about the adaptation. So I think it is, we often see technology change both our physical environment and our social practices. And I think it's really important that we make conscious decisions about that and we co-design that. So we don't resist those changes, but we think about who's in the room when we're setting our new norms or designing our new practices. So trivial example, the rise of the dishwasher means we all switch to dishwasher safe crockery. We change our practice because the machine isn't actually as good as it claims to be. The machine doesn't replace the human who washed the dishes carefully. It's a bit rougher, and so we have to switch our environment to kind of fit the machine. Self-driving cars, if they come, will be very much the same. We will change our streets and environments to fit them rather than them getting perfect at driving down those windy streets. So whether that will be street furniture that's specifically oriented towards making it easier for the self-driving car. But those questions are ones we absolutely have to co-design and not leave just the technologist with the profit motive designing that, but say, well, what as a community do we want? So can we switch many more of our streets to the single lane street with the cycle lane and everything else when we've got this technology coming, because we changed the design of our space to work with the technology because the technologies interact with environments. And similarly, the social conventions and practices we develop. So if we're also, again, really simple example, but if we're all switching to sending our messages with ChatGPT, our emails back and forwards, what's etiquette about saying when we've done that or not? The footer that just says, I've sent this with AI or not. You know, in the early days of the net, as we adapted to coming online, there was a big netiquette sort of set of conventions about how do you move your offline letter writing to this text-based medium. And I think we need those conversations again about, well, what is even our simple etiquettes for using these tools in our social interactions so that everyone's informed and making a choice and thinking about it rather than again, the product design of these things, and this attaches that seeing these in their wider context is coming out of a Silicon Valley frictionless product design that doesn't want us to think about their use, that wants them just to slot into kind of life and subtly change things. And the more we can just sort of gently surface them, make them visible, make them something we're empowered to talk about, I think the better.
And just to quickly, sorry, I'll try and be quick. Universal basic income. I mean, nothing is a panacea, and anyone who tells you something's a panacea immediately disbelieve anything they say. But I think it's a potential foundation of a future society that's structured very differently from now. And this is at the center of my book, Change Everything, is at the moment, most of us do what a boss tells us to do. That's how we spend the majority of our time, energy, and talents. In the old socialist system, USSR, etc., the state told people how to spend their time, energy, and talents. Potentially what UBI does is lets people decide for themselves how to spend their time, energy, and talents. And I'd very much agree with the comment that Bear left in the chat. I mean, I don't talk about people not having anything to do. I think we need to regard human resources as an extremely scarce, valuable resource that has to be used well. And the people who best know how to use that resource is the individual concerned. You know, we have an aging society. We have birth rates on the planet falling off a cliff. We have huge problems: climate emergency, nature crisis, poverty, pandemics, everything else. You know, we need to regard human talents and time as a huge resource to be husbanded and used well, and that, you know, again, gives us a start to think about where might we want to use digital technologies and so-called AI in places that it does actually genuinely free up people to do the more important stuff.
I think that kind of debate about using these automation technologies to free up people to do the more creative stuff is all very well, but how many people coming through education system now or in the future are suitably qualified to do that more sophisticated work that can't be done by artificial intelligence? And I think, you know, it's likely to be those people that are not of the appropriate educational level that are going to be left behind first again.
Well,
So,
I would suggest the creative, you know, really valuable stuff that needs humans to do is holding the hand of a dying person and putting them in the last days of their life, having a nice cup of tea with the old lonely old man down the road. The human things and what they need are human skills, and those are skills that are not necessarily associated, you know, particularly, or possibly they're even negatively associated with large amounts of education. So, you know, what do we regard as valuable? What do we really need people doing? That's a very deep and important question.
I want to come back as well on something that I can't remember who touched on it, but it triggered in my mind the thought that when we do talk about some of these transitions into a more digital world, whether that's funding something like UBI, whether that's trying to differentiate between enterprises that fully digitize to maximize profitability, I think people generally forget that actually there's been a taxation methodology. I can't remember whether it's actually going on in the UK right now, but it has been going on it has operated in the UK for decades. And that's embedded in the pharmaceutical price regulation scheme. Now, what's interesting about PPRS is that for companies that produce medicines for the NHS, it's not their prices that are regulated, it's their profits. And their profits are a return on capital employed on their business with the NHS, not just on the gross profit made when they look at the difference between the price at which they sell and the price at which they produce the products. And what's interesting is that the calculation that underpins how much additional tax pharmaceutical companies were paying is based upon how much of this capital they're actually employing in the UK. Do they do research work in the UK? Do they manufacture in the UK? How much of the value in the medicines that are supplied to the NHS in the UK is wrapped up in that cost? So there's a way of differentiating the investment that an enterprise makes in the UK to sort out how much tax it might pay. Interesting, isn't it? Could you apply something similar at some point in the future to an Amazon of this world, to a Microsoft of this world? You know, these tech companies that are really easily able to move the profits they make around the world. The one point I would say about that is that multinational companies have always done that anyway. So this kind of argument that the tech companies are moving profits around the world, and isn't it immoral? You know, it might be, but it's nothing new. But the fact that there is a template that we might use in the UK to help change how we value, reward, and penalise companies based upon their practices and what they invest in the UK and in people in the UK, you know, perhaps there's already a model there.
Very quickly, first of all, the whole issue of getting multinational companies to pay their taxes. What you need first is a company, is a government that wants to make multinational companies pay their taxes. And until we get one of those, that's always going to be extremely difficult. But sort of more broadly, I mean, our UBI in 2017 and 2019 Green Party manifestos was significantly funded by a carbon tax, a rising carbon tax, and that was a social justice measure. But I can imagine, possibly not for the next election, but maybe the election after that, this will be more developed. You know, if something like ChatGPT wants to use all of that huge bulk of human-created data that it's scooping up and putting back together again, you know, that could be a tax, because that's all being created by human endeavour, human knowledge, human creativity, and so surely they should pay to be able to use it. And that's a very preliminary thought, but I think something we could take further in the future.
Thanks so much, everybody, for your comments on this, and thanks everybody in the chat for your questions. I think that this is, you know, a very interesting debate with people coming at it from a lot of different angles, and I think that within the Greens, it's something that our social policy has been talking about for a long time now. And I know what you're talking about, Natalie, with human element of things. I have so many friends who would be singers and dancers and artists who don't ever get that opportunity because they have to pay bills and they don't have parents who can support them to do that. And so I think that maintaining you know, a vision of the future where we actually get to be what we want to be, because we have a social network that supports us in order to do that, and we have technological systems that do jobs that are necessary. That would be great. Tim?
However, I think it's Molly Scott Cato I've heard said before that one of the costs of a UBI will be a lot more bad poetry gets written, and it is damaging that ChatGPT has now cornered that market as well, if you've ever asked it to write. So you know, it is, yeah, the machines are coming for even our bad poetry writing.
Well,
Bad poetry. Yes.
Molly
Sorry,
may have
Natalie.
borrowed that one from me, but I don't think it'll. Well, you know, yes, ChatGPT might write bad poetry, but I think people will keep writing bad poetry, and some of what people write will be very fine poetry. And the story of the creation behind the poetry is, of course, something that ChatGPT doesn't have.
Can never have, absolutely.
Can never have, absolutely.
But it might do in 10 years' time. And that's the interesting debate that Foresight helps us have. What if? Because we didn't think we'd have ChatGPT 5 years ago.
I mean, ChatGPT is just a very good search engine, isn't it? I'm not going to throw that in at the end. Take it away. I take it away. Okay, so at the end of these sessions, I always like to go back to our speakers and say, if you could say one thing that everybody here will take away with them, what would it be? You can have about a minute each just to think about what do you want them to take away from this. If they didn't listen to anything, if they came in right at the end and you think, okay, I want them to just think about this one thing when they think about artificial intelligence and AI, what would it be? And Steve, you're still unmuted from before, so I'll let you start, and then I will go to Tim.
I've just actually unmuted myself in my excitement, because a few times now I've mentioned the power of foresight, and people who don't understand foresight might think it's a little bit like, oh, you know, I get asked, oh, where's your crystal ball? What are your predictions? Foresight isn't about prediction. Foresight is about helping us understand the nature of uncertainty, about developing plausible views of the future so that we can actually take decisions now in a more informed way that help us move towards a more desirable future. So my wish would be that people explore the potential of foresight when they're talking not just about AI, but actually about anything in the future. Because rather than just saying, I believe that the future is increasingly uncertain, do something about it that helps you understand the nature of that uncertainty and become more comfortable working with it.
Thank you, Steve. Okay, and now moving over to Tim.
So I guess maybe a yes and on that. I think foresight's powerful, but so is our history. And if we look back at even the early Eliza bot, the first kind of chat bot that made it through, just replying back to people almost with what they said, and it had many people saying similar things about sentience is almost there. And I think Natalie opened highlighting that kind of AI almost there. That doesn't mean we shouldn't keep considering it, but we should very much keep our focus on addressing, you know, thinking of the future, but addressing where we are now and our present challenges with technologies, and not accept technologies without question and say these are our tools, these are products being offered to us in our lives as with any other product. Let's ask, do we want it? Who controls it? Who's profiting? Who's benefiting? Who's harmed? And who's accountable for it? And I think those questions are what I want to leave people with.
Thanks, Tim. Okay, and last but absolutely not least, Natalie.
I'm going to squeeze three things in. The thing that I started with and majored on, which is that technology does not determine the future. It's politics and human actions that makes history. Technology may open up possibilities, but it doesn't determine it. A second thing that I haven't talked about, but I think really needs to be mentioned, is to think about diversity. We know from ecology that resilience and security comes from a diversity. And we have a huge problem around the world that the way in which we live, our dependence on digital technologies and our digital technologies are incredibly same all around the world. And I've recently read and love a book by the late great David Graeber, The Dawn of Everything, which reminds us just how incredibly varied the ways human societies have arranged themselves, have created art and culture in the past. And we actually really need to use digital in ways that helps recreate diversity. And finally, I think we need to not be too hubristic about what our machines do versus what nature does. Nature has systems that have developed over hundreds of millions of years. You think about how complex, if you're lucky enough to have a rich meadow outside your window, how incredibly complex the interaction of the insects, the birds, the fungi, the bacteria, the viruses, the plants. We still have anything like as complex or resilient or sophisticated as all of that. We are human animals, and we cannot lose contact with that biology, and we have to fit the digital within the biological, acknowledging that the biological is incredibly sophisticated and must not be treated as some kind of simple mechanistic system. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Natalie, and thank you so much to all of our speakers. I think that this is a subject that we'll definitely be able to come back to in the Cloud Cafe, because I think that there's, like Natalie just said, there's things that we haven't even touched on that are a really important core part of this debate. To pull some interesting facts from our 3 speakers that we've had tonight, you know, in a world of personalization and convenience lifestyle, we want these technologies to make everything easier for us sometimes. And that's when, you know, the capitalistic view that we have at the moment can be beneficial in some ways, but can also be really hurting, especially to specific areas and peoples within our communities. So making sure that, like Tim said, we have the right people around the table when these decisions are not only being made, but when the discussion and debate is happening that leads to these discussions. And then, as Natalie said, and I think was a really key line through all of our speakers' comments, is that like education is going to be key in this. Whatever part of life you are at, you know, we need to learn of how critical thinking, how to tell the truth from apart from falsehoods and misinformation, and that's going to become a bigger part of our life, especially as Tim mentioned in elections, and how that's going to impact us and how that's going to impact voters in the future. So as always, keep your wits about you, and as Natalie mentioned, politics does decide everything. So whoever you are and whatever you vote for, just vote, and tell all your friends to vote, and tell people in shops and cafes to vote, and everybody that you can, and go and knock on doors and just get involved, because that's really what will make the big difference in the long run on all of these subjects that we discuss on the Cloud Cafe. If you would also like to be so kind, everybody gives their time for free to arrange these Cloud Cafes, our speakers and the organizers in the background, as always. A big shout to Elizabeth and to Sue and to Lynn, who work very hard getting these speakers together. If you'd like to donate to our fundraiser for the Cloud Cafes, we would really appreciate that. As always, this is recorded, and you can find the recording on our YouTube channel very soon after the session ends. And please share it with people. Let other people understand a little bit more about AI and artificial intelligence, and get involved in the debate and the discussion. Thank you so much, everybody, for giving us your time, especially our very fantastic speakers tonight. We really appreciate that, but also to all of our audience for always coming back and being part of the Cloud Cafe community and the Stroud District Greens community. So we really appreciate that. Have a lovely evening, everyone, and we'll see you next month. Bye, guys.